Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for our PFAS Mini Bootcamp Export Series. This is part one on behalf of the U.S. Commercial Service and Connecticut District Export Council. Again, I would like to welcome you to our first part of our two-part series on PFAS Mini Bootcamp for U.S. Exporter Training Series. My name is Tony Sardis. I'm a senior commercial international trade specialist with the U.S. Commercial Service based in Connecticut. I am your host for today's session. Before we begin our presentation, just have a few housekeeping items to note. This webinar is being recorded. If you object, please disconnect at this time. Everyone is in listen-only mode, so if you do have a question, there is a feature on the bottom right-hand side of your screen, a Q&A box. You may type your questions in that box at any time during the presentation. If the question is pertinent to the content that the presenters are covering at that time, I will try to insert that question during the presentation. If not, we will try to address those questions. Okay. One final note, the views and opinions expressed in today's presentation may It's part of the U.S. Department of Commerce International Trade Administration. Companies that are in this sector, the environmental sector, whether it's wastewater, industrial water, or air pollution controls, or waste management and recycling. Our team website, trade.gov/environmental technologies, where you can receive information on upcoming events through our monthly newsletter, or review future programming, as well as various market intelligence that's available on our trade.gov/environmental technologies website. If you're looking to get in touch with your local trade specialist wherever you sit in the country, please connect with me directly, and I'd be happy to facilitate that introduction. Now I'd like to introduce today's guest speakers. First, we have Dr. Brian Drollet. Is a managing environmental scientist at Exponent in Boston, Massachusetts. His consultant practice focuses on chemical forensics to understand how and why contaminants enter the environment. He advises clients on risk mitigation and regulatory compliance and litigation matters related to emerging contaminants, including PFAS, as well as legacy pollutants. Also joining us today is Alfredo Fernandez. He is a partner with Shipman & Goodwin in Hartford, Connecticut. He advises companies on environmental and international trade matters and chairs the firm's manufacturing industry team. Alfredo advises clients on regulatory compliance, transactional due diligence, remediation of contaminated properties, and the abatement of hazardous building materials. Leading the firm's international trade practice, Alfredo advises companies on export, import, and economic sanctions. Prior to his law career, Alfredo worked as an aerospace engineer for an aircraft engine manufacturer. Alfredo is also a valuable member of our Connecticut District Export Council. So Alfredo, welcome back. Thank you for joining us. And Brian, thank you for participating in today's webinar. And we look forward to your presentation.
Great, thank you, Tony, and welcome everybody who's already in or floating in the first few minutes here after our 1 o'clock Eastern time start. We're sitting in the Northeast. Brian and I have some snow outside of our windows. Depending where you are in the country, hopefully you have a little better weather. As Tony mentioned, this is the first session of a two-part series that we developed here. It's focused on PFAS for the exporting community. Today will be a basic introduction to PFAS for those that may not be particularly familiar with that acronym, and we'll explain what all that is. And then we'll preview a little bit of our part two, which will be coming up in about a month. That'll be a little deeper technical dive into some issues beyond the basics. So looking ahead at what we're going to cover today, we're going to get a little bit about why you might start hearing about PFAS if you haven't already. It's in the news. You're going to start hearing about it at different types of business meetings if you haven't already. Brian will go over a little bit of the brief history of this miracle chemical, or really a class of chemicals, a couple relevant definitions for purposes of finding the right regulatory bucket for these types of contaminants. We'll explain its prevalence in the environment, and really the preview is that it's everywhere. And and then a lot of our analysis piece will come into the legal and regulatory developments covering PFAS at the moment and maybe where it's going, and then focus on what businesses can be doing with respect to PFAS today and going forward. A couple headlines here we grabbed from recent news. You start seeing these in major publications if you haven't already. There's some writers out there that are kind of focusing only on PFAS these days, but it is a growing issue of interest. It's a type of contamination that is raising some eyebrows in terms of human health concerns and how prevalent it is, and the potential health risk linkages are serious enough to garner more and more attention for both the general public and the regulators. So we're starting to see quite a bit of PFAS type headlines, and businesses need to be keeping up with them. So we like to start here with what's this all about? You may be hearing about PFAS, and we'll explain what the PFAS actually means in just a couple slides here. But they are a hot and emerging contaminant of concern. We joke that they're moving fast and furious because PFAS is just a funny acronym to say. But every time I can add a P to a word that starts with an F, I try to do so. It entertains me, maybe not everybody else. But they were initially introduced as a wonder chemical that were frankly going to change the world, and really their functional feature is what they do to surfaces in terms of functionality there. We'll get into a little bit about what that means as well. But at the time they were created all by man, they were thought to be a very exciting development in chemistry in recent years. Turns out the environmental baggage that comes with them may outweigh the utility in most cases. So environmentally, these things do get into all types of environmental media: soil, water, air. They don't really break down. They accumulate. They stay there forever, and hence sometimes they're referred to as the forever chemicals, because chemically it's extremely hard to break them down. They're in rainwater. If you put a glass out on a rain, you go test that rainwater, it's probably going to have PFAS in it. They even found it on snow and ice at the top of Mount Everest, just to hit home exactly how widespread this has become over time. From the environment, any kind of consumption at enough levels of consumption can pose some health risks, and they will accumulate in the body, not only of humans but also of animals that may become human food, and it stays in there. So that's a little bit why we focus this whole series on PFAS, because there is quite a bit of PFAS about the PFAS. One of the takeaways for this preliminary, the basics session, is that uncertainty should be the word you're associating with PFAS at virtually every element, every way of looking at PFAS. There is some major level of uncertainty, and these terms we threw in the question mark here are not the only things with uncertainty, but a lot of the things that come up in our advice to clients. Just picking a couple random ones: which lab methods are approved for use? What are the actual health linkages and health effects of PFAS, and how much PFAS in the human body is required before you see that? How do you remediate it? Which ways, if you need to treat soil, if you need to treat groundwater, those processes and treatments are still a work in progress, very early in understanding the state of the science as to how to best treat them. What kind of agency enforcement are we looking at? Varies at the federal level and state to state, but we are starting to see the agencies try to figure out where their enforcement priorities are going to be. If you're in a transaction type of situation, I want to acquire that company, I want to buy that parcel next to mine. What kind of due diligence questions are you thinking about in terms of the PFAS impact, not just for the current moment of the transaction, but the long-term view as to how these things may get regulated, etc. So again, not the full exhaustive list, but an idea of all the things that have a major element of uncertainty when we're talking about PFAS. And like I said, that's one of the big takeaways from PFAS in general. Plenty to worry about, but there's a lot of uncertainty, and as that uncertainty gradually shrinks with research and better science and understanding and public awareness, some of that uncertainty shrinks, but some of the risk becomes clearer. Go ahead, Brian, on this one.
Thanks, Alfredo. And so Alfredo just primed the pump about why PFOS is in the news these days and why we can't seem to get away from it. But what I want to do is discuss a little bit about our understanding of why PFOS were and continue to have such utility in everyday products. We need to understand that it's important to know how they came in the market in the first place. So they were developed in the late 1940s. More traditional PFAS surfactants that we discussed today were really considered marvels of their time, and the possibilities for their inclusion into everyday products really seemed endless, as Alfredo mentioned earlier. This quote from the LA Times in 1953 really sums up the hype at the time. You'll have clothes that can't get dirty, auto tires that won't wear out, and 100 other miracles. So quickly, products containing fluorocarbons in one way or another entered the consumer market and really paved the way for the many conveniences that we appreciate today, like nonstick coatings or waterproof raincoats, for example. When we step back and ask, well, what does PFAS actually look like in use? We often see collages like these, which these days are shown in nearly every presentation on the topic, and some might say this conveys everything you might need to know about PFAS. And while it does convey a wide array of products, such as medical devices and applications like fire suppressants, it perhaps does make you wonder what PFAS actually is. So PFAS, the acronym, stands for per and poly-fluoroalkyl substances. In an environmental context, we typically refer to the PFAS as small molecules, such as the structure that's shown on the screen here that has those characteristic carbon-fluorine bonds. In a consumer product context, we might refer to PFAS as those larger polymers that actually make up the coating on your nonstick frying pan, for example. Per and poly-fluoroalkyl substances is a mouthful, but it's easy for us to kind of break down the nomenclature, and we'll use the structure of the molecule on the screen, which is perfluorooctanoic acid, or PFOA, as an example. So PFOA is one of the most well-known, well-studied, well-regulated PFAS compounds today, and it has this general structure of an 8-carbon chain with lots of fluorines attached to it. We refer to the 7 fully fluorinated carbons in the PFOA as the tail, and the remainder of the molecule is the head. And as the molecule, in this case, is fully fluorinated, we call it perfluoro. So perfluorooctanoic acid refers to the 8 carbons within the molecule, and then the type of the functional group on the head of the molecule. So it's this characteristic structure that was the miracle of the 1950s. Because the carbon fluorine tail is excellent at repelling both oil and water, it's pretty stable at high temperatures, and it can be incorporated onto surfaces of other materials thanks to its ability to have different functional groups on the head of that molecule. So that's what we mean when we, I guess, chemically define per and polyfluoroalkyl substances. But there's one thing for sure, and that there's disagreement in the scientific and regulatory world over what we should or should not consider quote unquote PFAS. So what defines PFAS? And that's another question that seems like it should be simple, but it's really not. Does PFAS have a specific meaning? The answer to that question really depends on who you're asking or where you're asking the question. As this quote from EPA explains, the term is an acronym for per and polyfluoroalkyl substances, but there is no precise, clear definition of what constitutes a PFAS substance, giving the inclusion of partially fluorinated substances, polymers, and ill-defined reaction products on these various lists. So the bottom line is that even EPA might not put a solid definition on the term PFAS. So back to the original question, what is PFAS? Well, These example molecules on the slide are per and polyfluorinated, but are they PFAS? On the left, we have PFOS, which is a historical substance that it's kind of framed our modern discussion and definition of PFAS. It tends to be included in pretty much every definition. Other substances may or may not be included in a certain definition depending on the regulatory body. And that's a point that's illustrated by this table, which uses 3 different regulation-based lists to categorize PFAS. So TSCA Section 8A reporting rule has over 1,300 structures on it. But the 3 molecules that we see here, only PFAS is included on that TSCA list. The EPA PFAS master list has more than 9,000 structures on it, which includes PFOS and this small fluorinated molecule in the middle, which is a refrigerant that's probably used in your car's air conditioning system. And then finally, the state of Maine recently passed a bill which greatly increases the number of chemical structures which could be considered a PFAS. And by definition, it includes molecules such as the one on the right, which is a pharmaceutical that contains a fully fluorinated carbon atom. So clearly, this is a growing field of regulation, and it's certainly, one could call it word soup. And Alfredo, do you want to chime in here on that?
Yeah, one of our our takeaways from that prior slide and this slide is that the list is huge. We're talking thousands of compounds, and even then, not every regulatory body has agreed on which thousands of compounds is the full list, and it tends to grow every time you Google, how many PFAS are there. And it's, really based on almost infinite variations on chemistry that could still fit this ill-defined definition of what is PFAS. And it's one of the takeaways here is that it's virtually impossible for any one person at a company to keep track of all of these things perfectly because they are so many, and the bounds and the contours of what is a PFAS and what is not is so squishy, depending on which regulatory reference you're looking at. So it is a challenge to keep tabs of chemical inventories and things like that as well. And you hear a little bit more about some of the more well-used or the more heavily used substances like PFOA and PFOS and a couple others, a handful or so, probably 10 or less, where you keep seeing them, at least in our world, keep seeing them with specific standards tied to those specific compounds as a tiny, tiny subset of the total ocean of PFAS here. So that was the takeaway, Brian.
Well said.
Sorry, I think I skipped an extra slide for you.
So now that we've discussed a bit of how PFAS are defined or not defined, I want to briefly take a moment and just talk about why they were so useful. And it really all has to do with surface tension, or how surfaces interact with one another. If you take the example on the left of adding PFAS surfactants to a paint, will increase its wettability, or it helps reduce the surface tension between the paint and the wood surface, allowing the paint to spread out more evenly and dry more uniformly on the surface. On the contrary, the example on the right shows what happens when we include PFAS-based coatings directly onto the solid material. It decreases wettability and provides a liquid repellence to that surface. So the ability to change surface properties is really powerful, and PFAS allows us to do that using smaller and smaller amounts compared to, say, a non-fluorinated chemical. And manipulating surface properties is the main advantage, and why PFAS are used so ubiquitously in many different products. As a consumer, you probably benefited from PFAS chemistry when your raincoat kept you dry or when you painted your walls, and in your businesses, you probably used or handled some products which contained PFAS at one time or another. And Alfredo will discuss some of those implications in a little bit. But finally, one of the more well-known applications of PFAS chemicals is in the use of firefighting foams, often referred to as AFFF or aqueous film-forming foams. The surface-changing properties that we just discussed are really on full display when applying AFFF to say a petroleum fire, because the water and the foam mixture forms a nice even layer across that liquid air surface, which aids in extinguishing the flames. So as carbon-fluorine bonds are one of the strongest in nature, it has this ability to withstand very high temperatures, and that's exactly what you're looking for in a firefighting foam. So now that we've discussed kind of the how and the why PFAS are used in consumer products and industrial applications at a very high level, you probably have a sense of how these chemicals might get into the environment. We can think of basically two modes of entry into the environment. And here I'm referring to the environment as water, soil, sediment, air, and the like. So we have direct application, and that's exactly what it sounds like. We intentionally introduce these into the environment for a specific purpose, whether it's to extinguish a fire or perhaps increase the performance of a pesticide or herbicide when it's sprayed onto crops. An indirect application, however, is often the result of the product end of life when we discard the item to a landfill, or the emissions from manufacturing when we use PFAS chemicals, or simply without even realizing we're doing so if the PFAS itself is an unintended byproduct in the material. But one thing is for sure, and that's all the PFAS that we're referring to them today are synthetic chemicals, and their occurrence in the environment is entirely from anthropogenic or human activities. And it's been demonstrated numerous times in that PFAS occur in most environmental matrices or types of samples. So from seawater to Arctic ice to probably the soil in your backyard. And an interesting recent example of this is a statewide study that measured certain PFAS in soils in the state of Vermont. So in this study, every single sample across the state had detectable levels of PFOS one way or another. And it's this consistent presence at the forefront of today's conversation between the historical use, the regulation, and the environmental occurrence. And the idea of what's present in the background also has implications for businesses that are involved in remediating these chemicals.
Yeah, let's stay here, Brian, for a minute and talk about background. That was one of the unknowns in the question mark slide a few minutes ago. I want to emphasize here that this study showed that I think in this case it was PFOS was present in every sample that the state of Vermont actively went out and took for purposes of helping establish what the baseline levels of PFAS are. And that's another unknown. You know, what is the baseline? And what is the expected okay number out in the environment, whether it's water or soil, that's just going to be okay and accepted as kind of the line that's going to be defined somehow, that under it, probably not a big deal, it's just there. And over it, we start worrying about, you know, potential exposure pathways, human health risks, animal health risks, etc. How that comes into practice, at least and as a legal advisor, is that when you are looking at a client transaction, want to buy a property, want to sell a property, lease a property, lend on a property, the understanding that if you go sample as a buyer, you want to know it's there, you're probably going to find it, and then what are you going to do with that information? As a seller, you probably don't want to have someone, you know, go test the soil because it's probably going to be identified at some level, maybe very low, but in the world of PFAS, as we'll get to in a couple slides, very low can still trigger a couple regulatory requirements, or at least exceed some kind of guidance levels there. So it doesn't take a lot to start posing a problem, at least on paper. And this kind of understanding, it's a growing body of evidence as more sampling just naturally becomes of interest to both government regulators and private parties to understand where is that line above which I care and below which I don't really care. And at the moment, there really is not a clear answer as to where that sits.
Well said. So finally, when talking about PFAS in the environment, we also need to briefly mention our current understanding of the human and ecological risk of PFAS, which is actually driving today's environmental control measures, such as the regulation in drinking water or soil cleanup standards and regulation in products, which Alfredo is going to discuss. So I'll note that neither of us are human health experts. However, we understand that the science is rapidly evolving, and as only a handful of the thousands of PFAS compounds have been studied meaningfully, there is a data gap that researchers are trying to fill and regulators are trying to address as we speak. So on that note of regulation, I'll pass it over to Alfredo to continue the conversation.
Sure. And let's stay here, one
Sure.
slide back, Brian, just because we haven't hit it yet. I don't think we've said, what is my health risk? And maybe you're asking less as a business person, but more as I'm a human consumer. Should I be worried about this stuff? Again, we're not doctors, but this is the published, this a clip from the published list, and we have some citation websites there if you want to check those out. But increased cholesterol, there is a high blood pressure. There's some potential children or reproductive type issues, both for pregnant women and young kids there for the body. And there's a less known about potential cancer type issues that I don't think the science is really there yet, but it sometimes pops up. The environmental effects, as we mentioned, these things are persistent and they bioaccumulate, so that if a little fish eats it, the big fish eats the little fish, it stays in the big fish, and the human eats the big fish, the human consumes that because it doesn't break down naturally in those hosts. And thus, when it gets into a river or stream or something like that, there is an immediate containment concern for purposes of potential food sources that live in the river. In terms of exposure to humans, and I jokingly added the over-the-top PPE fella over there. Mostly consumption of PFAS contaminated materials, whether that's drinking water, another type of fluid or solid food, or breathing in air. Again, science is very much not there yet in having a really good grip on all of those things, and also contact with some of the treated surfaces directly to the skin. All right, just want to hit that. So I get that question a lot kind of casually, so I wanted to make sure we hit that too. Okay, in terms of what that means from a regulatory and legal background, given or a regulatory and legal landscape, given the background we've hit, where why these chemicals are in the environment, what kind of potential health risks they pose, why they're everywhere, at least at low levels, and why this regulatory body now exists of these laws. And we have a little map of the United States here, just representative of different colors mean how intensely each state is regulating PFAS, and each state is kind of doing it their own way because the federal law is not all the way there at the pace that the states want to see for their own jurisdictions. So some states may be focused on things like firefighting foam prohibitions or bans, or others may be focused on drinking water levels, etc. And they're each doing it differently. So for businesses working in multiple states, or with a supply chain in multiple states, customer base in multiple states, there may be some interjurisdictional issues to worry about. It may not necessarily be your home base type of operation.
Alfredo, just one question that came in regarding AFFF, and so there's no federal regulation that outlaws it for firefighting currently. Is it a state by state regulation?
Right. The AFFF regulatory picture is a little quirky at the moment. There are some federal government requirements, particularly through DoD, that require certain facilities to maintain AFFF as the fire suppression system because it functionally works well to put out fires. And not unlike the Titanic, it takes a lot to move the government in a nimble way when they see something coming. So the government has announced some phase out and some cutoff dates. I think in 2023 and 2024 are some relevant dates where there's going to be some kind of transition away from those requirements. And I just saw an article the other day about a new mil spec that may be coming out for purposes of requirements and specifications for firefighting foams at some military facilities. So that's one of those things that's in the process of changing. But some facilities are in this quirky no man's land where a federal government requirement mandates that they have AFFF on site, but the state that they physically sit in, this facility, is in a state that's banned AFFF, and maybe there's some carve outs for that exact type of scenario. But we do see a bit of federal state conflict in terms of where the AFFF piece can sit from a regulatory perspective, and there's some state level waivers and things like that we've advised some clients on. But that's one of those issues that's a couple years away from kind of smoothing out some of those conflicts at the federal and state levels.
Just to add to that, I will mention that this will be a topic covered next month in part 2 of our webinar series on specific technologies. But just as a little bit of a preview, since the early 2000s, there's been fluorine-free AFFF that's come on the market, and more companies are getting into that space, anticipating a ban on AFFF that does contain fluorine. And some of those fluorine-free alternatives are made synthetically from polysaccharides and proteins, and that's something that we'll cover next month in part 2 as well.
Yeah, that's a good reminder, and there can be AFFF without PFAS in the formulation, which is an important distinction. Just without getting into too many weeds here, because each of these bullet points here could be its own slide or its own presentation. Really, on the regulatory and legal regulation type developments at the federal level, the Biden administration is looking to make at least 2 PFAS substances, quote unquote, hazardous substances under a federal environmental law called CERCLA, sometimes referred to as Superfund, but it's the main or a big federal environmental remediation law. If that does happen, and the plan is that it happens, expected I think 2023, then under certain environmental due diligence requirements, such as the ASTM1 phase 1 standard is kind of the default due diligence standard for evaluating a property before you buy it, will require environmental professionals to evaluate the potential risk of those two or more PFAS substances on the hazardous substance list by definition. So that will start popping up in a lot of transactional due diligence as soon as that hits, and the ASTM standard has recently undergone some changes with that expectation that it's going to happen. And at the moment, it's a little gray, but they do acknowledge the fact that PFAS are a contaminant to be looked at in the course of due diligence, and have some ways to bring that information into an environmental report, even though it's not a hazardous substances, capital H, capital S, that is expected. And again, without getting into details, and we'll hit a couple of these things in terms of current standards and where they may be going from a technology perspective in part 2 as well. We'll get a little bit into the drinking water standard. The drinking water obviously is a higher kind of consumption concern for humans, so that is getting a lot of attention. And there's some chemical reporting, so there's some kind of inventory management questions coming up here as well. we are starting to see a little bit of state regulators from a wastewater perspective or landfill management perspective start setting stronger limits. And then at the state level, like I said, each one is doing its own thing, and we're seeing some state-specific bans for certain types of products known to contain PFAS. For example, food contact containers are phased out in a few states. AFFF containing PFAS are phased out in several states, and or either immediately or there's a date by which they will be phased out. And Maine, the state of Maine, is the first of its kind to put essentially a blanket ban on PFAS by the year 2030. That's a big deal with anyone kind of engaging in business in or through Maine. And as Brian mentioned in one of the earlier slides, that's going to have some unintended consequences based on how broadly they've defined at the state level what the definition of PFAS will be for purposes of that ban. Clearly, the state of Maine was not intending to ban pharmaceutical products that happen to chemically meet that definition, but at the moment, the way it's written, there's an argument that that pharmaceutical product could be banned. So there's a long enough runway between now and 2030 where some of those kinks might be worked out, but we don't expect Maine to be the last state to go that hard with a target like that. On the international level, the European Union is of similar mind to the United States in terms of gradual, if not aggressive, regulation to phase PFAS out of common day life. At least if we can't stop what's already in the environment, we may be able to stop, recurring contamination sources. And there's a Stockholm Convention, which is essentially a group of international governments that have come together and looked at some hazardous compounds and have agreed that if we add it to this list, our governments are going to agree to phase it out, to it's gradually ban the trade of these things and help reduce the presence of that. A couple of PFAS substances have been added to the Stockholm Convention list. Again, it's kind of it doesn't have that much teeth yet by way of enforcement and forcing countries to actually do something about it from what we've seen, but it is an international treaty, so to speak, on the kind of the understood consensus to start phasing out some of these products, and that involves a lot of European companies and others. And then on an international perspective, again, this has an exporter audience focus today. So when dealing with an international supply chain or an international customer base, you may want to start thinking about if I need to make some representations to my customers that this product is PFAS free, I need to go back to my suppliers to make sure what my raw materials have. And my raw materials come from a country that is completely oblivious to PFAS or doesn't care about regulating it. And my suppliers don't know left or right about PFAS. And how am I supposed to make that representation? Otherwise, we see some documents called comfort letters that are essentially a lot of couching with a statement that says, we don't know of any PFAS in the materials. They're not intentionally added. So they're a little bit qualified, a little bit couched, but sometimes that's as good as you can get for purposes of documenting your materials. I'm just checking it. Brian, did you want to talk here? I'm just going to read a question that came through on the side here.
Apologies, I was muted. Yeah, certainly. So water quality is probably the biggest focus that you might be hearing about on a state level, and you might be hearing about it more and more on a federal level. So right now, in the context of drinking water, there is no federal maximum contaminant limit for any PFAS compound in your drinking water. So nothing with federal authority. The EPA does have a health advisory level for 2 specific PFAS compounds, and the concentration for that health advisory level is 70 parts per trillion in your drinking water. Now, a part per trillion is not a lot, as it sounds. functionally, you can think of it as a drop in 20 Olympic-sized swimming pools. So we're really not talking about a lot here. At the state level, many states are setting lower enforceable drinking water limits within their state. So they are enforceable. Some are keeping in the, say, mid 10s to 20 part per trillion, depending on the compound. Some states are trying to set that lower in the single digit part per trillion levels. And others have thrown out some pretty impressive public health goal concentrations of below 1 part per trillion for certain PFOS in drinking water. So that's been a huge focus of continued development. And then on the wastewater side, as facilities are discharging wastewater either to a treatment plant or to the environment, only very recently has EPA developed laboratory analytical methods that can measure PFAS in wastewater, and therefore they can be applied to, say, Clean Water Act NPDES permits. Some states are already requiring monitoring in certain situations, but at the moment, wastewater is lagging a bit behind the regulation in the drinking water space. But water quality is certainly the biggest focus of environmental regulation of PFAS to date.
That's right. And the state Brian mentioned, under 1 part per trillion, you're talking parts per quadrillion. That's PPQ, which is unheard of from a level of minute detail and detectability. So it's lofty and it's optimistic, but it's hard to see today where the technology is to keep up with that kind of goal. And it's a goal. That's not an enforceable level quite yet out west, but was a shocker to see a few months ago when we saw PPQ for the first time, because one of the takeaways here is that we're talking PPT, parts per trillion, which is an order of magnitude more detailed and minuscule than parts per billion that we see a lot for traditional contaminants, or even parts per million that we're used to seeing in certain other regulatory standards. It's just it doesn't take a lot of PFAS to start getting you a little. So the question I paused to read was probably more on the previous slide that I'll just bring up for purposes of answering this question while we're going, and feel free to drop more questions as we continue through here. Do the EPA regulations apply to all products manufactured in the U.S.? Requirements for PFAS? And that's a great question. And the answer may depend on exactly which EPA regulation or rule or statute we're talking about. I don't think I got the name. Oh, Chris. Some things you may have to do regardless if you're not planning on selling it in the United States at all, like you are exclusively exporting this product. There may be a couple things that you still have to worry about, such as reporting chemical inventories, etc. Now, from the purposes of a U.S. consumer health perspective, there may be some carve-outs because if that's not your market, it's not there. And then on the state-by-state specific bans, or if you make something that is specifically banned by a state, it would just depend on the exact wording of the state law there. So it's a bit of a non-answer, but likely there's going to be some hook, even if you're not selling a product in the United States, but making it here and exporting it exclusively. All right, let's continue. So we hit a little bit of the regulatory development with a government body posing some kind of limit or threshold here. I want to expand that a little bit here to the legal development broader than just government, really private party type litigation that we're seeing more and more of. Just yesterday, I saw a headline that a class of plaintiffs was certified in Ohio for certain purposes, the details of which I haven't studied much yet, but a new class action that popped up. And what we've seen the most of so far from a legal perspective is suits brought against PFAS manufacturers, meaning those that are purposefully making PFAS as their products. Similarly, the U.S. military has been on the receiving end of several lawsuits because the U.S. military is a heavy PFAS user and has been for 40, 50 years. So a lot of their operational facilities and bases are kind of hotspots, for lack of a better term, and some of the properties down gradient of the bases have some documented PFAS contamination issues. Also, we're seeing the federal government bring some criminal investigations, which was interesting to see. They have a report, and they didn't give us very specifics to the public, but they said multiple criminal investigations underway. We don't really know what that means yet, but we expect to see some press release if they're able to bring something home with a home run type of case. Some states are bringing lawsuits against various parties they deem culpable, including manufacturers, but seeing the states get in the driver's seat here across the country, and again, some local municipalities and water systems that get stuck, with drinking water that they can't really pass on, or the quality is not to their own snuff, based on contamination to their water reserves and reservoirs, that type of thing. We've seen some of those, and as I mentioned, some class action suits starting to pop up, like the firefighter unions and things like that, that would have had a higher exposure type of thing. Future litigation, I don't want to predict it's going to be kind of the asbestos litigation, but it could be, where a lot of asbestos litigation started out kind of slow until the lawyers figured out how to do it from a plaintiff side and from a defense side. But there could be some product liability type issues, not just for manufacturers of PFAS, but for manufacturers who make a product with intentionally added or potentially unintentionally added PFAS if it's there anyway. There could be some cleanup type lawsuits from an environmental perspective, bodily injury and property damage. That's my BIPD note there. Breaches of contract. There could be workers' comp for folks exposed to PFAS in the course of their job. And there's going to be surely some kind of insurance coverage dispute where either it's an insured disputing with an insurance company, or two insurance companies disputing as to which policy tends to control, or reinsurance, or that whole mess of insurance litigation. So as the regulations become more firm, as public awareness of PFAS becomes more and more in the day-to-day, mindset of people, we will start seeing more and more types of PFAS litigation. So from a business perspective, we are advising, and we'll get to this in a little bit, a bit of a look ahead, or an internal look as to potential legal liabilities for your company in light of an expectation of more PFAS related litigation. So a couple consequences of those regulatory and legal developments that we wanted to hit home and bring it a little bit more to the forefront for business points here. We're dealing with really low regulatory limits. Again, parts per trillion is so small. If you're going to test, you're almost always going to find it. And professionals in our, like us in this space, if we ever get a sample that doesn't have PFAS in it, if there is a PFAS sampling event, it's surprising because it is so everywhere. So the default expectation should be, if I'm sampling, I'm going to see at least a little bit of it. It may not be over 70 ppt for a drinking water threshold, but like we said, some states are setting thresholds below that, and states are figuring out what their remediation thresholds are going to be like for things like soil and groundwater. There are going to be some outright bans coming up, and there are some current partial bans on specific types of products. So if you're not looking at that, that's another thing to monitor, kind of the current state and the future state. And there's a lot of bills in the state governments that have to go through the legislative process, may die as a bill and not make it into law. But there are some online resources to track some of those bills for product bans and other kinds of PFAS related legislative action. Some of our some companies are looking at replacement chemicals if they were PFAS manufacturers themselves, or using a PFAS heavy raw material. Is there a substitute I can do without without PFAS in it, so I can just take this headache off the table, at least going forward. You know, what's happened in the past is out of anyone's control, but for purposes of mitigating risk going forward, are there some replacements that can occur? We'll talk about that again a little bit more in part 2 as to where the replacement product picture stands from a technology perspective. One thing we haven't hit very deeply yet is that with these PPT levels, the ability to cross-contaminate is so easy, which makes things so hard to do right without a cross-contamination issue. And that can be from the field work of sampling, things like perfumes or cosmetics, or the clothing that the field technician is wearing could affect the sample just because it only takes, you know, a couple PPT to screw up a sample, and that could brush off a material. If they, you know, they're sitting on a Scotch Guard seat on their drive-in, that could be a thing. Again, once you get to the lab, different types of tubing and glass and lab equipment could also have PFAS in them. So a lot of the leading labs have retooled some of their equipment to address, you know, or mitigate the chances of PFAS cross-contamination in their samples. So even when you do sample, you do run the risk of a cross-contamination issue, and you want to make sure your consultants and labs have the right kind of protocols and experience to mitigate those chances. Lastly, just in the interest of time, we'll skip a few here, but the multi-jurisdictional piece is tough for businesses doing business in multiple states, which is most of us these days. Transactional due diligence, I mentioned, from a buying and selling perspective, who's doing what and who's going to allow what when it comes to the amount of PFAS information to be revealed. And then, you know, your own company's risk management practices, you know, are they equipped to handle this kind of new emerging contaminant risk?
So with all these new regulations and the new rulemaking and the general uncertainty surrounding PFAS, it can be difficult to understand who might be affected by them. So if you have a good trusted legal advisor like Alfredo, that's a great step. If you don't, often EPA will publish lists of, quote, potentially affected entities. A good example of this is in the 2020 National Defense Authorization Act. There's requiring new reporting rules for certain PFAS. So here, businesses are required to report on the use and release of over 170 different PFAS compounds that are used in commerce. And a list of industries that are potentially affected by that rulemaking was provided by EPA, and it included what you might expect: textile manufacturers, printing operations, chemical manufacturing, electronics manufacturers, and more, all which may have historically used PFAS, or they're currently using PFAS one way or another in their operations.
Okay, so this may be our last substantive slide before we preview our part 2 for a second here, and we're making good time here with our targets. In terms of what can businesses be doing, what should they be doing, and this slide is based on advice, you know, we're providing clients today. We recommend a legal technical coordination on all these issues. You know, if you've been listening for the last 53 minutes, you realize there's a lot of science here. There's a lot of technical detail that needs to be thought through. There's also a lot of legal liability just oozing here. So the combination of a legal team with a technical team as advisors is recommended, and that's how we see it works best. Just so you know, we often will, as a law firm, engage an environmental consultant to help our legal advice to a client, so that some of those dialogues, impressions, drafts may have the benefit of the attorney-client privilege from a disclosure perspective, as opposed to just working directly with a consultant that would be the same type of information without that legal privilege. In terms of assessing where you are today, we do recommend a focus on how you're approaching due diligence, and you may not be in actively buying or selling any properties right now, or business partners or JVs. But if those do come up, the diligence there before a transaction is important, because as we mentioned, what may be uncertain today, in 10 years from now, or at the end of a lease or something like that, could be very different from a requirements perspective. And you want to start, crystal balling as much as you can, even though it's not a particularly clear picture. We do have, the industry does have some ideas as to how to plan for risk on a lot of these things. And again, the buyer and the seller positions could be vastly different when it comes to PFAS. You want to also look at your supply chain agreements that we discussed. What are you requiring from your suppliers? Often that's informed by what's being required of you from your customers in terms of certifying that a formulation is PFAS free, that you're not using intentionally added PFAS materials, et cetera, or surfaces with PFAS materials in it, like a nonstick ramp or whatever. And we've seen some of those squishy supply chain type agreements come up, and it's kind of a developing body as to how do I respond to this kind of question, or how do I push this down, flow it down to my own suppliers. There's a proposed data collection rule from EPA. EPA is very much in the data collection knowledge growth mode right now, where they do want to have more data from which to make policy decisions. So there is some facilities are going to be subject to submitting data to EPA if they're not already. That if you are subject to that kind of rule, there is going to be some inward looking. Let's look at our SDSs, our suppliers, our formulations, our bills of material. Are we subject to this kind of stuff in terms of disclosing to the government what we have here? And then, one of the deliverables we end up providing clients is a risk management plan that we facilitate, where it's a desktop analysis of where a business's potential vulnerabilities could be. Again, without sampling, this is understanding your suppliers, the nature of your product, what inputs go into your process, what outputs go out, who are your customers, who's using your product, are they consumers, are they other industrial users, et cetera. But understanding the PFAS risk picture. Just spent a couple hours on a report on something like that last night. And again, we'd be, like I said, looking at raw material supply chains. If it's a food industry one, there's a particular human consumption concern there as well. If some of those risk management exercises at the desktop level kind of indicate that some testing would be appropriate in the controlled in a controlled way, where the results of the test that you can't control, or you never control what the data is going to show, if it can be a strategically scoped testing event, there may be benefit in understanding where along a flow of your business there could be some hits or risks, so to speak, and better define them with real data. Again, that's not the first step ever, but it is a step that could be of interest. And then looking at insurance as well, and potential PR type communications issues, having something in your back pocket and thing in case a crisis does occur based on data or something like that to have in mind. So those are just a couple things we're joint Exponent and Shipment are doing with various clients in terms of how to look at risk internally now in peacetime, so to speak, before it's full crisis mode if it ever gets there. And just as a preview for our next session, April 6th, we had to squeeze in a lot of basics here. Clearly, this topic is more than just an hour's worth of discussion. On our next session, we were trying to pick a topic that we don't really see in terms of like the webinar circuit much, focusing on PFAS technology specifically. We're going to be looking at where the labs stand with things, what kind of disposal and destruction options are, the best ways to minimize cross-contamination, what kind of consumer technologies, starting to bubble up from a water filter type perspective at home, and other types of, emission type controls and water treatment, all that stuff. So stay tuned for that if it's a topic of interest on April 6th. And I think we're wrapping up here, Tony. Bring us home.
Thank you, Alfredo. Brian, great job. We're going to have one question and then we'll close it down for the day. So last question, do you expect an exemption process for fluorinated compounds that are deemed safe that are deemed safe, that do not contaminate groundwater.
From a legal perspective, probably the initial reaction is going to be to trap it in the PFAS umbrella until data shows that it's not a problem, because chemically, a lot of those thousands of PFAS compounds haven't been tested, haven't been linked to health issues specifically, but because of chemical similarities, they're assumed to probably cause similar things. But as data for specific PFAS compounds become available, and if that is true, that something doesn't bioaccumulate, doesn't really pose a health risk hazard, and that could be years and years worth of data to kind of get to that level. There's probably going to be some ability to carve out certain PFAS compounds if that data ends up justifying it. But at first, my prediction is that it's going to get caught in the giant PFAS umbrella category, and then you're going to have to prove your way out of it.
Thank you, Alfred. What we'll do is, I know we're going to have some questions that'll be carryovers for our next session. So we have obviously a couple weeks. So if you do have questions related to today's session that we didn't address today, if you could forward me those questions, and then I'll get them to Alfredo and Brian to review. And then what we'll try to do is, as we kick off next session, we'll cover a few of those questions early on, and then we'll fold into the PFAS technology portion. Alfredo, Brian, thank you so much for presenting today. That'll do it for today. Thank you, everyone. Take care.
Thanks.
Thank you.